Over 60, top 5 seeds that protect eyes from aging damage. Let me hit you with a shocking fact. 99% of people over 60 have no idea that the secret to protecting their eyesight might already be sitting in their kitchen cabinet. Not in a pill bottle, not in some overpriced supplement, but in tiny little seeds most people ignore every single day. Now, you might be thinking, come on, doctor, how could seeds possibly protect my eyes? I get it, it sounds almost too simple, but the truth is, science has proven it. I've spent decades studying eye health and treating seniors, and I can tell you this. The right seeds can lower your risk of cataracts, help you see better at night, reduce dry eye, and even slow down macular degeneration, the #1 cause of blindness in older adults. And yet, hardly anyone knows it. Why? Because no one's telling you. Imagine this, you're spending hundreds, maybe thousands, on glasses, drops, or procedures, when all along a spoonful of these seeds a day could have been quietly protecting your vision. Doesn't that make you wonder what else we've been overlooking? In this video, I'm going to reveal the top 5 seeds that act like natural armor for your eyes. One of them, according to research, can reduce your risk of advanced macular degeneration by over 30%. And the best part, you can buy it at any grocery store for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Before we jump in, do me a favor, hit the like button, share this video with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel. That's what helps us keep creating eye-opening content, pun intended, that empowers you to stay healthy, independent, and sharp. All right, let's dive in, because once you hear about the first seed, you'll never look at your pantry the same way again. Why vision declines after 60? If your eyesight isn't as sharp as it used to be, you're not alone. Millions of Americans notice their vision fading after 60, but it's not simply bad luck or something you just have to accept. There are real biological reasons behind it. One of the biggest is oxidative stress. Every day, your eyes are exposed to sunlight, blue light from screens, and pollution. These create unstable molecules called free radicals that slowly chip away at the retina and lens. When you're young, antioxidants in your body keep that damage under control. But after 60, your defenses weaken and the damage builds. Another common issue is age-related macular degeneration, or AMD. This condition wears down the macula, the part of your retina that lets you see clearly straight ahead. It's the leading cause of blindness in older adults, affecting over 11 million Americans today, and that number is expected to double by 2050. People with AMD often find that reading becomes difficult, faces look blurred, or straight lines begin to look wavy. Cataracts are another problem. The clear lens of your eye is made of proteins, and with age, those proteins clump together, clouding your vision. By age 75, more than half of Americans either have cataracts or have had surgery to remove them. Symptoms often start as glare from headlights at night, faded colors, or just a general haze over your vision. Glaucoma is known as the silent thief of sight because it damages the optic nerve without early warning signs. Over 3 million Americans live with it, and about half don't even know it yet. That's why regular eye exams are so critical. Circulation problems also play a role. High blood pressure and diabetes can weaken the tiny blood vessels that feed your eyes. In fact, blurred vision is sometimes one of the first warning signs of uncontrolled blood sugar, and diabetic retinopathy is now a leading cause of blindness in older adults. Finally, even if you're eating well, your body doesn't absorb nutrients the way it used to. After 60, levels of lutein, zeaxanthin, vitamin E, zinc, and omega-3s often drop, leaving your eyes without the protection they need. The bottom line is this: blurred vision after 60 isn't random. It's the result of oxidative stress, macular damage, cataracts, glaucoma, circulation issues, and declining nutrition. But here's the hopeful part: you're not powerless. With the right foods, habits, and regular care, you can slow down these changes and protect your vision well into your later years. The science of eye protection. Your eyes are among the most hard-working organs in your body, and they depend on a steady supply of very specific nutrients to stay healthy. Lutein and zeaxanthin are two of the most important. These natural pigments act like sunglasses for your eyes, filtering out harmful blue light and protecting the retina. Research published in JAMA Ophthalmology has shown that people who consume more lutein and zeaxanthin are much less likely to develop advanced macular degeneration. If bright light seems harsher now than it did years ago, your eyes may be signaling a lack of these protective nutrients. Omega-3 fatty acids are just as vital. They help keep the retina functioning properly and support tear production, reducing the risk of dry eye. A Harvard study found that people with higher omega-3 intake were significantly less likely to suffer from chronic dry eye, a condition that becomes more common with age. Zinc is another key player. It works with vitamin A to produce melanin, a protective pigment in the eye. Without enough zinc, night vision declines and the risk of macular degeneration rises. The well-known age-related eye disease study, funded by the National Institutes of Health, demonstrated that supplements containing zinc, vitamin C, vitamin E, and antioxidants reduce the risk of advanced macular degeneration by about 25%. Vitamin E itself is one of the strongest defenses against oxidative stress, the gradual damage caused by free radicals. Studies in the archives of ophthalmology show that people who get enough vitamin E have a lower risk of developing cataracts, one of the leading causes of vision loss after 60. Polyphenols and other antioxidants also play an important role. They reduce inflammation throughout the eye, protecting delicate blood vessels and slowing the damage that contributes to conditions like glaucoma and AMD. The encouraging part is that you don't always need to rely on pills to get these nutrients. Seeds, tiny, inexpensive, and easy to add to meals, are some of the most concentrated natural sources. Chia and flax seeds deliver omega-3, pumpkin seeds provide zinc, sunflower seeds are rich in vitamin E, and sesame seeds are packed with unique antioxidants. So let me ask you this, how often do you think about your eyes when you sit down to eat? We often make food choices for heart health or weight control, but your vision deserves the same care. Protecting your sight can be as simple as adding a spoonful of seeds to your breakfast or sprinkling them over a salad. Sometimes the smallest choices really do make the biggest difference. Seed number 1, chia seeds, the omega-3 powerhouse. Chia seeds may be small, but don't let their size fool you. They are one of the richest plant-based sources of ALA omega-3 fatty acids, a nutrient your eyes desperately need as you age. Omega-3s are essential for the structure of the retina. They calm inflammation inside the eye, and they support healthy tear production, which helps prevent the dry, gritty feeling so many older adults struggle with. A Harvard study found that seniors who consumed higher levels of omega-3 had up to a 38% lower risk of developing advanced age-related macular degeneration, a condition that robs people of their central vision. Other research in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition linked omega-3 intake with a significant reduction in dry eye symptoms, especially in postmenopausal women, who are among the most vulnerable to this problem. I've seen these benefits firsthand in my own patients. Susan, a 67-year-old retired teacher, came to me complaining of dry, burning eyes that made it difficult to read for more than 15 minutes at a time. Instead of immediately prescribing drops, I suggested she add 2 tablespoons of chia seeds to her daily breakfast. She mixed them into her oatmeal most mornings. Within a month, her symptoms improved so noticeably that her ophthalmologist confirmed better tear stability on exam. She told me, "It feels like my eyes finally have a cushion of moisture again." That simple change gave her back the joy of reading every night before bed. Another patient, Harold, age 72, had been struggling with constant eye strain from long hours on his tablet. After incorporating chia seeds into his diet, usually blended into a fruit smoothie, he reported not only less strain, but also clearer vision during evening hours. His blood work later showed improved omega-3 levels, a reminder that small daily habits can change internal chemistry. So here's a question for you. When was the last time you thought about nourishing your eyes the way you nourish your heart? Most of us know omega-3s are good for cardiovascular health, but the retina is just as dependent on them. If you're not eating fish regularly, why not let chia seeds bridge that gap? The beauty of chia is how easy it is to use. You don't need to cook them or prepare anything complicated. Sprinkle a spoonful on top of your yogurt, stir them into oatmeal, or make a simple chia pudding by soaking them in milk overnight. They absorb liquid and form a gel-like texture that's not only satisfying, but also helps keep you hydrated. Consistency matters more than quantity. You don't need to eat a bowlful every day. Just 1 to 2 tablespoons regularly can provide meaningful protection for your vision. In my decades of practice, I've learned that the biggest improvements in eye health often come from the smallest adjustments. Chia seeds may not look like much, but they are a powerful ally in the fight against age-related vision loss. Isn't it worth considering that something so simple, something you can add to your breakfast tomorrow morning, might be one of the best defenses you have for protecting your sight? Seed number 2, flax seeds, nature's anti-inflammatory. Flax seeds are another powerful ally for aging eyes. Like chia, they are an excellent source of plant-based omega-3 fatty acids, but what makes them unique is their high content of lignans, compounds with strong antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. Chronic low-grade inflammation is one of the silent drivers of vision loss, and flaxseeds help calm that process. A 2015 study published in the Journal of Ophthalmology showed that flaxseed oil significantly reduced dry eye symptoms in older adults, improving both comfort and tear film stability. Other research has suggested that diets rich in lignans may lower the risk of oxidative damage that contributes to cataracts and macular degeneration. I've seen the benefits up close in my own practice. George, a 70-year-old retired engineer, came to me frustrated that long reading sessions left his vision blurred and his eyes feeling strained. He didn't want to rely on artificial tears forever, so we tried a dietary approach. I suggested adding 2 tablespoons of freshly ground flax seeds to his meals each day. He usually stirred them into his yogurt at breakfast or sprinkled them over homemade soups. After about 3 months, his vision strain eased, and he told me he could finally get through a full novel again without discomfort. His story isn't unique. Another patient, Maria, age 68, who suffered from postmenopausal dry eye, noticed less burning and irritation after incorporating flax seeds into her morning smoothies. Her improvement echoed the findings of clinical trials showing that omega-3s from flax can reduce the inflammation that disrupts tear production. Key with flax seeds is preparation. Whole seeds often pass through your system without being absorbed, so grinding them is essential to unlock their nutrients. You don't need to overthink it, just a coffee grinder or even buying pre-ground flaxseed will do the trick. Once ground, they're easy to mix into oatmeal, baked goods, or even a simple glass of water. Consistency is what counts. So here's something to consider. If your eyes often feel dry, tired, or strained, could a spoonful of ground flax seeds each day be the missing piece? In my experience, many seniors spend years relying on drops and medications without ever realizing that a small change in diet could provide relief. Sometimes, the simplest solutions are sitting right there in your pantry, waiting to be used. Seed number 3, pumpkin seeds, the zinc champion. Pumpkin seeds are one of the richest natural sources of zinc, a mineral that plays an essential role in retinal function and especially in night vision. Zinc helps vitamin produce melanin, the protective pigment in the eye, and without enough of it, the retina becomes more vulnerable to damage. The well-known age-related eye disease study, or ARDS, showed that zinc supplementation slowed the progression of macular degeneration, giving patients more years of useful vision. Additional research from the Journal of Nutrition found that seniors with higher zinc intake had significantly better visual function compared to those with lower intake. I've seen the impact of this simple mineral many times in my practice. Helen, a 72-year-old grandmother, came to me worried about her ability to drive at night. She described halos around headlights and difficulty adjusting when moving from bright to dark conditions. We looked at her diet and noticed she wasn't getting much zinc. I suggested adding a handful of pumpkin seeds daily, easy to sprinkle on her salad or enjoy roasted as a snack. Within 3 months, she reported that her night vision had noticeably improved and she felt confident driving again. Another patient, Robert, age 69, who loved hiking at dusk, struggled with poor adaptation to low light. After consistently including pumpkin seeds in his meals, he shared that his eyes adjusted more quickly and he could once again enjoy evening trails without hesitation. Pumpkin seeds also offer magnesium and antioxidants, which further support blood vessel health in the eye. This combination makes them more than just a zinc source. They're a complete package for aging vision. The best part is how simple they are to use. You can eat them raw, roast them for a crunchy snack, blend them into soups, or toss them on top of a salad. So let me ask you this. If such a small, tasty handful each day could help protect your night vision and slow the progression of macular degeneration, why wouldn't you make it a daily habit? In my decades as a physician, I've learned that it's often these easy, consistent choices, the ones hiding in plain sight, that make the biggest difference in preserving independence and quality of life. Seed number 4, sunflower seeds, vitamin E defense. Sunflower seeds are one of the richest everyday sources of vitamin E, a powerful antioxidant that shields the cells of the eye from oxidative stress. This matters because oxidative stress is a major contributor to cataracts and age-related macular degeneration. When free radicals damage the proteins in the lens begins to cloud over, and when they attack the retina, vision slowly fades. Research has consistently shown the protective role of vitamin E. One large study reported that people with the highest intake of vitamin E had about a 20% lower risk of developing cataracts compared to those with the lowest intake. Another study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that diets rich in vitamin E were linked to slower progression of macular degeneration. I've witnessed this in many of my patients. Frank, a 74-year-old retiree, came in complaining that bright sunlight made him squint constantly, and his optometrist had already noticed early clouding in his lenses. Instead of jumping straight to supplements, we focused on food. I recommended he start snacking on a small handful of sunflower seeds daily. After 3 months, his follow-up exam showed less progression of clouding, and he felt more comfortable outdoors. Another patient, Linda, age 70, loved gardening but often cut her time short because of glare. When she started sprinkling sunflower seeds on her salads and adding them to stir-fries, she told me her eyes felt more resilient, and she could enjoy her garden without as much strain. The beauty of sunflower seeds is their simplicity. You don't need to eat large amounts. Just a small handful several times a week provides a meaningful boost of vitamin E. They're easy to carry, easy to add to meals, and they deliver long-term protection in a way that's both natural and enjoyable. So here's a thought. If something as small as a sprinkle of seeds on your lunch could protect your lenses from clouding, isn't that worth making a habit? In my decades of practice, I've found that the most effective changes for eye health are often the simplest, and sunflower seeds are one of those changes anyone can start today. Seed number 5, sesame seeds, the ancient protector. Sesame seeds have been used in traditional diets for thousands of years, and modern science is now uncovering why they are so valuable for aging eyes. These tiny seeds are rich in sesamol, copper, and a wide range of antioxidants that fight oxidative stress, the very process that leads to cataracts, macular degeneration, and even early vision fatigue. Animal studies have shown that sesame seed extracts protect lens proteins from oxidative damage, slowing down the clouding process that turns into cataracts. Research published in the Journal of Medicinal Food also suggests that sesame's antioxidant compounds help preserve retinal health by reducing inflammation and improving circulation in the delicate blood vessels of the eye. I've seen how effective they can be in real life. Margaret, a 69-year-old retired nurse, added sesame seeds to her stir-fries after we discussed her evening eye fatigue. Within a few weeks, she reported that the strain she used to feel while reading at night had eased, allowing her to enjoy her favorite books again. Another patient, Thomas, age 71, had struggled with dull, washed-out colors when painting, his lifelong hobby. By including tahini, a sesame paste, in his daily lunches, he gradually noticed colors appearing sharper and more vibrant. He told me that he hadn't realized how much he was missing until he started to see those details again. Sesame seeds also provide copper, which supports blood flow, and healthy fats that make it easier for your body to absorb fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin E. That combination offers broad protection against the slow but steady damage that comes with age. The best part is how versatile they are. You can toss them into stir-fries, sprinkle them over roasted vegetables, mix them into bread dough, or spread tahini on whole grain toast. So let me ask you this. If a handful of sesame seeds could ease eye strain, sharpen colors, and protect against long-term damage, wouldn't it make sense to add them to your routine? In my years of practice, I've found that small, consistent habits are what truly preserve vision, and sesame seeds are one of those timeless foods that deserve a regular place on your plate. So there you have it, the top 5 seeds that can help protect your eyes from aging damage. Chia seeds to calm inflammation, flax seeds to fight dryness, pumpkin seeds to sharpen night vision, sunflower seeds to shield against cataracts, and sesame seeds to ease fatigue and preserve clarity. Tiny foods, yes, but each one carries powerful nutrients that science has proven can make a real difference for your vision after 60. If there's one thing I hope you take away, it's this: losing your eyesight with age is not inevitable. You are not powerless. Every spoonful, every small daily choice you make can add up to clearer vision, more independence, and more years of enjoying the people and moments that matter most. Now, I want to thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button, share it with someone you care about, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into health after 60. Your support is what keeps this channel alive and motivates us to bring you more science-backed, life-changing information. Take care of your eyes, take care of your health, and I'll see you in the next video.